been watching some of my live streams, I've been drawing every single day for the last month or so. And now I'm here to reflect on some of the things that I learned and share them with you all. And just a disclaimer, sorry for the bad quality or the graininess of the video. I really shoot things off of my webcam from my Mac, and the light quality, because it's been pretty gloomy here where I live, has been pretty bad, so it kind of makes things look a lot more grainy, but you know, it is what it is. I want to get this video out. The first thing I want to go ahead and talk about is tone and shadow. So something that I learned about looking at tone and shadow is you want to really look at them in terms of their shapes and the planes that they're on. A big key to making a two-dimensional shape look three-dimensional or realistic really just depends on how you're shading along that shape. There are actually a lot of video resources out there on YouTube that really go into depth about this, and it's really helped me kind of see things in terms of three-dimensional shapes rather than two-dimensional lines and things like that. And when it comes to portraits of faces, I've definitely learned and applied a lot more sort of understanding of shading in terms of planes, and the biggest thing that's sort of helped me with that is this thing called the Asaro head. And if you're not familiar, well, you know, here's a picture of it. And my personal understanding of the Asaro head has definitely helped in creating shadows on characters and portraits. And during this past month, I was able to also kind of study color a little bit more in terms of tone rather than just the hue, and this gave me a deeper understanding that colors essentially have different tones, and you could actually mix and match different colors to create shadows and depthness in whatever it is that you're drawing. During the past month, I also participated in Inktober, and I used a lot of Sumi ink, which really limited me to one color, which was essentially black, but if you dilute it, you got variations of grays, which helped me really focus in on understanding tone and value in those terms. By creating those different tones, I was able to apply them to the flat shapes on a piece of paper and use the tones to make those flat shapes appear three-dimensional. Okay, now let's go ahead and jump into what I've learned about using color. There are definitely a lot of YouTube videos out there about color and color theory and how people do color studies. I didn't really look at too much of that. I decided to go to my local library and actually look at some of the books that they had there on color to kind of read about the use of color and try to apply that to my own work. And the one book that I really focused on was called The Practical Handbook of Color for Artists. The first thing I learned is that you can manipulate how a space is perceived through the use of color. Warm tones specifically are usually good for making things pop out or stand out, which makes them really good for creating things in the foreground. Cool tones, on the other hand, usually make things seem as if they're receding, so that means that they're usually good for the background. And thirdly, and I think a lot of people probably already know this, but your use and choice of color within a particular drawing or piece or painting really affects the perception of the mood of whatever it is that you're creating. The next major thing that I learned is that paper matters. For a long time, I thought multimedia paper was a steal because you could use different mediums on it, but I learned over the past month this is probably not the best sort of paper to use, especially as a person who likes to draw and use graphite and use watercolors or water-based mediums. I've specifically used Canson's mixed media paper, and for my graphite and watercolor or ink work, I realized it doesn't really give me the best effect, and I had to go and venture into other different types of paper to really get what I was looking for. When I was looking for more of a smooth blend using colored pencils, I discovered that Bristol paper was the best type of paper for that. When I was using graphite, drawing paper was really good for that, especially when it comes to my method of shading. I really enjoy the tooth or the texture of the paper to kind of show through when I'm doing that sort of work. But I prefer the smoothness of Bristol paper, especially when I'm using colored pencils, because it would make the colored pencils that much more easier to blend into one another. And now I'm going to talk about watercolor paper. And watercolor paper is very specific. During my live streams, I used a lot of Canson's watercolor paper, and it had a lot of positives, but it also had a lot of negatives. So the positives included that it was pretty cheap. You got a lot of paper for the amount that you were being charged for it. The surface was very smooth. I thought that it was very useful for using sumi ink or maybe ink-based sort of mediums, and you could use a lot of it for practicing. Some of the things that I didn't really like from it was that when I was using watercolors, the watercolor itself would kind of sit on top of the surface and it wouldn't kind of seep into the paper, and I didn't really like that. I also found that it kind of bloomed a lot, and I also didn't really like that sort of effect when using my watercolors. It was also very hard for me to get smooth blends when I was doing like the wet on wet technique and doing blends that way. And when I was using certain types of paint, I would experience some separation of the colors. For example, like Payne's Gray is like a mix of a whole bunch of different colors, and when I would use it specifically on Canson paper, I would see a separation of the blue hues and the sort of brownish orange hues that kind of went into creating the paint itself, and that was something I was not looking for when painting. My preferred paper when it comes to watercolors or water-based or ink-based mediums is Arches paper, and that is a longtime staple, as I found out, in the watercolor community, or any sort of paper that has that similar sort of texture. And I think Arches specifically is like 100% cotton, which I can really truly see the difference in, especially in doing any sort of watercolor type of work. So some positives that I had from the experience with Arches paper have been that I definitely got easier blends when using wet on wet technique. There was a longer dry time, which I actually really liked, because then I could add to other colors and things like that. And there was also less blooming, thank goodness, that I also really appreciated. And I also noticed that it did seem as if the watercolor itself would absorb into the paper. The only downside to Arches watercolor paper, and I'm sure with other 100% cotton type of paper, is that you're usually going to pay a lot more for that more quality type of paper. If any of y'all out there have any suggestions or alternatives that are cheaper than Arches, go ahead and let me know in the comment area. The next thing that I learned was working in layers. Through working in layers, you're able to kind of build up the colors, you can build up the tones and the shadows and things like that, and that is something that can give your pieces a lot more dimension and more realism if that is something that you are aiming towards. And for me, I typically work from light to dark, And essentially, I am capturing the highlights, so keeping the light spots, as light as I can, and then building up some of the layers of, like, let's say graphite to create the contours and shadows and things like that when it comes to drawing or even doing watercolors. The next thing that I learned from drawing every day over the past month as a self-taught artist has been to practice. And I know that this may seem a little bit redundant, but you can watch and read as much as you can up on art and art techniques and things like that. But if you want to create art, you're going to have to apply everything that you're absorbing in from those things into your actual art. If you aren't practicing, you're not going to discover the best methods and things that you like when you're creating your different art pieces. I think one big misconception about practicing is creating something that is perfect, but I don't think that practicing should have the aim of creating a perfect art piece. I really think of practicing as an act of exploration, because you can really discover what you like or dislike in terms of using different mediums or different methodology and things like that. I'm definitely a person who's committed to my development and growth, which is really attributed to practicing. And the last thing that I learned on this journey over the last month of creating every day as a self-taught artist is that you should create a space to have all of your works kind of curated. I think it's important for your work to be seen and for you to be proud of the work that you've created, whether that means posting it on Instagram or posting it on Twitter, now known as X, or even Tumblr. You could also use that as a way to look back and kind of see your progress of where you started and, where you are at now in the moment. I know it can sometimes be scary to show your work off because, let's be honest, we can be sensitive to criticism. But for me, my art process has always been about creating a space of joy and creating a space of self-exploration. And I think a lot more people should probably look at their art in terms of that as well. And even better, focusing on the creation of art as a reflection of your own personal experiences and being able to share those experiences with others. I think with this sort of mindset, you open yourself up to be non-judgmental to your own process, and you allow yourself to freely create and freely express, which is a big part of what I feel as if art should be used for, and what I believe art is for. And with that being said, that is some of the stuff that I learned through this last month of drawing every day as a self-taught artist. I hope that you continue on with your journey and you continue drawing and practicing and, discovering the best things that you like when you're creating. But I will go ahead and see y'all in the next one. Thank you for watching.